Welcome to the J. Scott Outdoors podcast. Today we have Phil Cramer, and Phil is a fellow Coues deer nut, and I'm a sponsor over on the CouesWhitetail.com website, and I always enjoy seeing Phil's content, and it's always nice to talk to a fellow Coues deer nut. And today we're going to be talking about Coues deer hunting in Sonora, Mexico, and I've had some feedback from you guys, the listeners, that you'd like to hear from some guys that aren't outfitters and maybe just from Everyday Joe. Sorry about that, Phil. Everyday Joe's perspective of hunting in Mexico, and quite honestly, sometimes the everyday Joe, quote unquote, is just as into it as some of the outfitter buddies that I know. So hopefully you don't take any disrespect from that, Phil, but you kind of get where I'm going. I want to just talk to a quote unquote a normal person about their impressions and their experiences and their strategies in Mexico, and hopefully some of the listeners out there can relate. Phil, how you doing?
I'm doing good, Jay. Thank you, and no disrespect at all taken. Yeah, definitely a Coues deer nut, and I don't know if there's any of us that are quite normal that are Coues deer nuts, but
That's true.
I'll do the best I can to give a good perspective.
That's awesome. Phil, first and foremost, what line of work are you in? So when you're not Coues deer hunting, what are you doing?
I'm a contractor, and I work for a large drilling company. If it has anything to do with putting a hole in the ground, we do it. Everything from domestic water wells to oil and gas exploration. I'm currently the division manager for the U.S. on the underground side of things. So we do a lot of gold, copper, nickel, zinc, and lead exploration underground.
Gotcha. And does that line of work have you traveling outside of Arizona quite a bit?
It does. I spend probably 2 weeks out of every month on the road, everywhere from northern Canada to southern Mexico, and pretty much the U.S. covered from coast to coast.
That's awesome. I know with copper and some of the prices coming back, it sure seems like there's renewed energy, as so to speak, in the drilling. Are you seeing that in your activities and such over the last 6 months, year? Are you seeing things pick up?
We are, and it's a great breath of fresh air that we're seeing, because we've been in a downturn actually for the last about 4.5 years. And you just about nailed it on the head. Over the last 6 months, we've seen investors really get excited with the future potential of the prices going up and staying up, more importantly. And then really after the last election, the presidential election, we've seen a lot of investors jump on projects that normally wouldn't be funded. And anytime that happens, it breathes a lot of energy as well as new funds into the drilling industry. Not for just like myself, that's an actual drilling contractor, but for the people who supply us. So our vendors are excited as well. And it should be a really good, I'd say at least next year, and we hope to sustain it into the long term as well.
Awesome. Well, I wish you the best. The reason I want to talk to you today on the podcast, like we talked earlier, was I want to talk about Sonora, Mexico. And Dar and I just got back from our first trip down there. Usually we plan both of our hunts. We try and take two groups of 5. We try and plan them around the rut. This year we had a couple of young guys in high school, and their dads wanted to take them kind of during Christmas break, and it's a little difficult because we know that when the deer are not rutting on some of these ranches in Mexico, they can be tough because they're not moving around as much, and the deer are bedded most of the day. A lot of times they're nocturnal. These are my Dar and I's perceptions, and this trip was very similar in what we found. We found that within the first hour of light, those deer were already starting to bed down, and then throughout the day they would get up several times just to change positions and then bed back down, and did not have a lot of activity We were able to go 5 for 5 on bucks, but we really had to work at it. And we actually lost a day and a half kind of to rain and inclement weather. But I wanna dive into your experiences in Mexico and maybe start off by saying, when was your first trip to Sonora for Coues deer, and was it a mountain or a desert ranch, and then maybe how it progressed over to where you're at now?
Okay. My first trip was probably 9.5 years ago. I actually met a couple fellow hunters on CouesWhitetail.com, and I was interested in going down to Sonora as a do-it-yourself type hunt. I just kind of wanted to get my feet wet and see what it was about. I'd heard great things, not only from you, but from other outfitters that I know that have been down there, and they've always told me that you needed to go experience it for yourself. And I went ahead and arranged that, and I was fortunate enough to, like I said, meet a couple guys from Coues Whitetail that had some experience in going down, and it was a mountain ranch. We went down and actually scouted it in, I'd say, early November, if I remember correctly. It was very similar to what I'd been told. We didn't see much deer movement at all. We did see a lot of deer early in the morning and late, right before the sunset. I was amazed at how many deer were actually in very small, congested areas. And the mountain ranch that I first hunted was more of mesquite, ocotillo type vegetation and very few oaks. It seemed to produce a lot of deer numbers, but not necessarily high quality as far as trophy potential. But it was my first adventure down into Mexico, and I was very excited. We ended up hunting that ranch the first week of January, and I spent 10 days on it, and I feel that I just barely missed the rut. The rut seemed to be really picking up towards the end of my hunt. I was fortunate enough to kill what I consider a very nice buck, especially for my first one down in Mexico, 108 and a half. And after that, I was hooked. I've been going just about every year since then. I've had a great opportunity to hunt not only mountain ranches, but also desert ranches. Two different types of hunting, as you well know. The deer tend to, on the mountain ranches, be more visible. You're able to spot them a lot more and get up high on a vantage point. The desert ranches, not so much. Sometimes you might have 1-2 glassable areas on the ranch, and the rest of it might be rolling hills and flats. But over the course of the years, desert ranches, for me, in my experience, have produced larger bucks or more of the higher quality of bucks than the mountain ranches, but the mountain ranches have produced more deer, period. They're very fun. They're exciting hunts. But as you mentioned just a little bit ago, when you don't hit that rut right, it can be pretty difficult, and that you spend a lot of time glassing and picking apart the country and trying to dig them out of their beds because their activity level is just not there as when you hit that rut, or even some of the pre-rut when they're moving around looking for those.
For sure. I mean, you summed it up perfectly there. And for those listeners that aren't Coues deer nuts, or maybe they're just starting out, like Phil pointed out, there's mountain ranches, which I'm going to say are, 4,000 feet and above. And then there's desert ranches, which I'm going to say are, say 4,000 feet and below. And a lot of the desert ranches are down on the desert floor, hence the name, the desert ranches. And they've just got these big cone knobs, and most of these desert ranches, a lot of them are big properties. They've got some big cone knobs, but it may be a mile or 2 or 5 between knobs. You may have some little intermittent rolling hills and such, and it for me, it gives a chance for those deer to not be easy prey to us hunters that are glassing across canyons and up on ridges and having access to shoot them at 300, 400, 500 yards. Some of the deer on those desert ranches, you may get up on a big cone knob and get out there and glass a deer at 3 miles away. But as soon as you get down on the level with that deer, they virtually become, impossible to find. So I would totally agree with you that, historically, deer out of the desert tend to be bigger. You see some giant trophies taken out of the desert flats, and quite honestly, a lot of big deer out of the desert get shot from guys high racking and mule deer hunting and just happen across a big Coues deer buck. One of the things that Dar and I try and focus on guiding our hunters on mountain ranches. And one of the reasons why is because when you're taking a group of 5 guys, hunting mountain ranches is a lot more enjoyable for a group and for the success of the hunters. And Phil, I'll ask you about this in a minute, but you could go down on a desert ranch and you could go maybe a day or two and not even see a deer on some ranches. One of the best the best Coues deer I ever killed was on a flats ranch down in a flats desert ranch down south of Hermosillo, and the big deer live out in those desert flats, and this was no exception. He was 133 and 6/8 inch buck, just a big non-typical. I'm actually looking at him up here on my wall. He's got forked eye guards, he's got a little drop tine, and just a big old buck. But the challenge is taking guys that want to go down and experience Mexico. For us, taking guys on mountain ranches where you have more opportunity, 1, to see deer, and 2, you have more opportunity to actually see them and then move in and make a stalk, makes for, in my mind, a better experience and better guiding. Now the flats ranches, in my opinion, are perfect for the guys that have a lot of time, maybe 10 days, 2 weeks, or even more, or be able to go down for, 10 days at a time and do multiple trips and set cameras and sit water, and it takes a lot more patience and takes, you have to be in exactly the right place at the right time to even harvest a deer, none less a big deer. So I'm curious. I mean, with all that being said, we have killed some phenomenal bucks on mountain ranches. But I will stipulate that if you had a lot of time, and you didn't have too many guys hunting, that you could year after year go on these desert flats ranches and probably shoot a big deer year after year after year. Your thoughts, Phil?
I think that's exactly right. And something I'd like to add to that, I believe there's a little bit of a progression as a Coues hunter, at least there has been for me, is you get to the point, I mean, it's still a thrill no matter what size the buck is that I see, but you get to a point where I'm okay with passing that 105-inch deer hoping for the 110, and I'm okay passing that 110 hoping for the 115. And even though it's not always about the score, it could be about the character. But the reason why I go to Mexico is because I'm looking for that monster. It took me a long time to get in my personal hunting career to be able to pass that 110, to hold out for that 115. And frankly, I had a lot of friends hunting desert ranches well before I ever was introduced to them. And I was so reluctant to go down to the desert ranches because, just like you said, you might hunt for 2 days and you might not ever see a deer. You might go that stretch and catch it where the weather's 80, 85 degrees and the deer aren't moving, and you really have no opportunity other than sitting water. And that's fine, but it took me a long time in my personal hunting career to be able to be okay with that. As you said, it's on the mountain ranches, and I agree with this, it's typically easier, and it's still a hunt, and it can be very hard, but it's typically easier to spot a buck and be able to move in on that buck. And normally you get to see those, 20 and above type days where you're seeing 20 or more deer a day. And sometimes in the desert ranches, you might not ever see one in 2 or 3 days. Now, the other thing that kept me from going ahead and jumping into the desert ranches is yourself and Dar and some of my other friends that I know who do guide down there. they were pulling out those phenomenal bucks, and every once in a while they'd bring in that 125, 130 inch monster. And my hope was that I would be doing that. And, it got to the point where I was like, you know what, I need to up my odds, because time is a commodity to me, and even take a lot of time off work. Fortunately, I'm able to. I wasn't getting the result that I wanted, and maybe it because I wasn't hunting the right ranch. I firmly believe I was in certain situations, but I needed to increase my odds, and that's why I went to the desert ranches. But wholeheartedly, if I was taking other hunters down there, I would be focusing more on the mountain ranches, just for the same reasons that you said. The desert ranches, what we've found with a lot of the guys that I hunt with, it's more of taking inventory by trail cameras other than using your optics and letting them do the work, because it's just the terrain lends itself to the tanks, to sit in water, because as you mentioned, you might not be able to hunt that country unless you high rack it or sit water. And that's the thing with the desert ranches. But I also believe that's part of the reason why they tend to produce larger deer, is I think the predators have a harder time killing those larger age class bucks, for the same reason we do, is because it's harder to see them. It's harder to put a stalk on them when you're down at their level. You can't get on the bluff and wait for them to come through at a pinch point. You can't stalk around the top of a ridge or over a bluff or a cliff to be able to get the vantage point you need to get onto that buck. And I think that's part of the reason that we see these bigger, higher class bucks coming out of the desert ranches. And that's the same reason why I'm down there hunting them. And it does take time, and it takes a large investment, not only for the time during the hunt, but we've been going down typically after Thanksgiving and setting anywhere between 50 and 100 trail cameras to basically up our odds and increase our chances of killing that monster buck that we want to kill, that we all dream about. And that's why we're spending the time and the effort on some of these desert ranches that you just wouldn't be able to hunt otherwise.
Yeah, for sure. And I think too, another reason why those deer are bigger is in a lot of those ranches the density isn't as high, so there's not as much competition for food, and that they can get really good nutrients and such. And it always seems that the real high density ranches in general, whether mountain ranch or desert, they don't have as big of deer. But if you get into that low to medium density, it's been our experience that a lot of times you can find some of those great bucks that we're all looking for. And so it's always a happy medium for Darn and I when we're going down in the off season and scouting ranches and trying to figure out which ranches we're going to hunt for the following year. If we go and see a bunch of deer, sometimes that throws us off, and we're like, well, this is probably going to be a high density ranch, and you may see 25 bucks in a day, but you might not see one buck over 100, and you might hunt a week in January during the prime of the rut, and the best bucks you kill might be 100, 102 inches, and a bunch of deer in the 90s. So for us, it's always finding that happy medium of not too high of density, but enough density to pique our interest. And then another thing I think is you have to have size. You've got to have properties that have size. If they're too small, it may work if they're fresh and they haven't been hunted, ever, or haven't been hunted for years. There may be, 2 or 3 bucks of interest that are really good, but you have to have size and have to have area, in order for those, when we're taking a group of 5 guys, we want all 5 guys to harvest nice bucks. So it's a challenge, dealing with trying to lease properties down there, because a lot of times the ranchers will get, say, 10 deer on their UMA registration, which is through the government, or even 20 deer, and that, man, you can't shoot more than 4 or 5 deer a year off of that place to maintain the quality of deer that us Americans going down there are looking for. So curious your thoughts on Well, I want to shift gears a little bit. How is the antler growth looking this year for you guys in Sonora compared to other years? Is it average, above average, or below?
Well, from what we've seen so far, on both of our trips, I made a trip down there after Thanksgiving, and with a hunting partner of mine, and then actually he went down between Christmas and New Year's and checked a lot of the cameras for us and spent a little time hunting. And both from what we saw with our binoculars and our optics, as well as what the trail cameras are showing, is this is going to turn out to be one of the best years we've seen in probably the last 4 or 5 years. We have bucks that we have history with, both from when they first started hunting the ranches that we are, as well as now that I'm getting involved with it, that we have on trail camera as well as we've laid eyes on, and they've really jumped up. Now, part of that's due to what we believe is the conditions are right. It seemed that even though all of the cowboys we talked to this year said they had very little rain compared to years previous, the vegetation and the grasses and the new green growth has shown that they had the rain at the right times. And what we've come to find out is the cowboys typically want the larger rains that's going to fill up their tanks and add water to, the long term throughout the year, which means might not be the same impression that we have of good rains being the slow drip, steady drizzles that are great for the vegetation. When we first went down this year, we said it's probably the most lush we've seen in, like I said, 4 or 5 years, and it got our hopes up very fast. And those hopes are now turning into high expectations for this season, because the trail cameras are showing, and what we've been able to see with our own eyes is that the deer put on a lot of inches. They've added mass, they've added tine length, and even some of them are adding some width that we didn't expect to be that way. It's really exciting, and we're looking forward to it. Probably more so than ever this year. We have more bucks on camera that we have on our hit list than we've ever had before. That we've always had the 1, 2, 3, 4. That okay, this is the top of the list. This is a shooter the first day, the first minute when we get out there, and then we were always hoping that something else would show up, or a buck that's got some cool character, we'd want to take it. But this year, there's no arguments. I mean, it's just out there that the bucks on our hit list are big, mature deer, and there's more of them this year than we've ever seen before in the past. And like I said, it's very exciting. I can't wait to get down there at all.
That's awesome. When do you head down for your first actual trip hunting?
We're going to go down and cross the border the morning of the 16th of January, for a couple of different reasons. We try and work the moon phase as best we can, but historically what we found is sometime in that third week in January, the rut's pretty much going to be happening. The weather might still be warm. The conditions might not be ideal, but that's if you had to pick a week, and from what I've found personally, if I pick that week, I'm pretty much guaranteeing I'm going to hit part of the rut. It might be the latter end, or it might be the beginning of it. But most of the time, if you hit that third week, second, towards the end of the second, the third week, you're going to be hitting the rut. And that's what we like to hunt. Even on the desert ranches, not so much because it makes them more visible for glassing, but we've tend to find, and what I believe, is that when they are more active during that rut, they're craving water more. They have to make themselves go into that tank to not only replenish what they've burned up chousing does, but also to cool off, and they also start using it as a social area where they can check does and pick up different scents. And from what we've seen both on the trail cameras as well as sitting water, is we need that rut to kick in to have a higher success as sitting water and make those bucks come in more during the day, and opposed to being nocturnal and things like that.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with a couple of functions there. One, they are chasing does, so they need water to replenish their bodies. But two, the does tend to hit the water a lot, and so a lot of times those bucks are hitting those waters as more of where the girl's at and checking on them and checking their scent and making scrapes and scent lines and what have you. Licking branches and all that kind of stuff near those tanks because then other deer come by and check them. Will you guys primarily be hunting sitting ground blinds with a rifle, or will you be sitting with your bows? And what kind of strategy as far as, are you sitting sun up to sundown? And then the next question, sorry to bombard you, but what are your peak hours that you're seeing the most movement when you're there, say the 16th through the end of January? What are your peak hours of movement?
Okay, to address the first question, we'll have a combination of both rifle and bow. This year, especially, it'll be more on the rifle side of things. We typically try and get a group of guys to go down. It's kind of that happy medium you were talking about. You don't want too many to basically have competition amongst yourselves, but you want enough to be able to secure enough property and ranches to spread the cost of the tags out that you have a good area to hunt. So we have guys from all over their Coues career, as you call it, from fairly new beginners to myself and my hunting partner who have been hunting Coues deer most of our adult life as well as into our teens. But that's the reason why we have a mix of both bow and rifle. Primarily this year will be rifle, and for a couple of different reasons. The water level in a lot of the tanks are lower than it's been in the past, and that tends to make the shot distances longer from where we're setting up blinds. And the reason being is we try and get the blinds back along the brush line as best we can. And as I said earlier, the cowboys said they just didn't get the rains, and by that they didn't get the runoffs to fill up a lot of the tanks. So the water level in the tanks are down quite a bit, and the quality of bucks that are on our hit list this year, we don't want to take an opportunity of having the bow in the blind and passing up that buck if he presents a shot that you wouldn't be able to use with the bow. And right now, even for myself, I'm looking for that giant buck, and whether it be with a rifle or a bow, I don't really care at this point. It's about getting him down on the ground. To address some of the other questions you asked there, typically we'll get in the blind fairly early, not necessarily before dark. And the main reason is we see prime time usually during that time of year to be anywhere between 9 and 2 o'clock, with the most activity around 10 o'clock to noon. Those seem to be your two highest traffic times in and out of the water. We'll get in certain situations when we're pinpointing one particular buck, and he might be the odd character that comes in at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But for the most part, we'll get in the blind typically around daylight, and we'll get out of the blind anywhere from noon to 2 o'clock. If it's been very slow that day, we'll climb out at noon, and we'll typically go back and check as many cameras as we can and pull the memory cards on it, and then spend the afternoon glassing ridges or going through pictures to see where our best opportunity will be for the next day. We're fortunate to be able to go down for 9, 10 times, 10 days at a time, where we have that luxury to be able to do that. If we were going down for a 4 or 5 day hunt, it probably wouldn't be that way. We'd probably pick a tank that a big buck on our hit list is coming in and sit it from daylight to dark, but you're going to have quite a bit of non-productive time given what we've learned both from the trail cameras as well as setting the tanks. Your magic couple hours is between 10 and noon. We try and set the blinds, like I said, a little bit after daylight till 2 at the latest normally. But usually between 9, 10, 11, 12 is when everything's hitting the water.
That makes perfect sense. In my mind, deer, from a safety standpoint, they're not going to bed down near the water hole. And so a lot of times they're kind of bedded up away from water, in my opinion, and then they, are feeding and what have you. And then before they're going to lay down for the day, a lot of times I think you're saying, 9, 10, 11, 12 o'clock is the prime time. I think they do their feeding while it's cool. They go ahead and head down to the water, get a drink, and then they go and lay up. And a lot of places where you're hunting, you're way south in Sonora, and your temperatures in the day, even in late January, could be in the 90s. And so, whereas a lot of hunting that we do is kind of in northern Sonora, where your temperatures are a lot cooler. I remember when I killed my biggest buck down there south of Hermosillo, it was in the 90 degrees on the thermometer on my truck in the afternoons when we would go out to glass for the afternoons. And those deer down on those desert ranches, they do act a little bit different than some of these deer on the mountain ranches, just because of temperature alone, I believe. But I think it makes sense, though, also that the deer are traveling to the water, and they're not bedded near the water usually, and so it takes them an hour or 2 or 3 to finally work their way down to the water, and then get their drink, chase the does, smell around for does, and then head back to their bedding, and then bed up from that noon to 3, 4, 5 o'clock, or even sometimes right before dark, depending on the temperature.
I agree with that for sure. And even earlier on when I was hunting Sonora quite a bit, we were hunting more towards Magdalena, closer to Agua Prieta a couple of years, and I was seeing, especially on those ranches, that the temperature was cool. I mean, I remember waking up a number of mornings where we had a skiff of snow on the ground, and your picture of the ideal rut, you're like, oh man, this is great, this is exciting, this is what the deer needed, the temperatures are cool, they're going to be moving all day. And as you go further south, that's just not the case, because like you said, sometimes we have temperatures of 90 degrees. I mean, we're getting sunburned, it's hot, you don't want to move, the deer don't want to move. And the other thing, you nailed it, and I firmly believe that it's taking them longer to get up from their bedding areas, and they're feeding, and they're not in a big hurry, especially if the bucks are chousing the does around. They're going to do their thing and eventually make their way into water. I really believe that has a large part to do with that time frame that I was talking about. And I think the other thing is, and you mentioned it just a little bit, is I think that's when they're comfortable. They can see well. Typically, the thermals have settled down, and they can smell well. Normally, the wind's not really gusting, and they feel more secure, coming into a water tank, where I firmly believe they feel fairly vulnerable, and they're hesitant to just come, walking in at any time. And I think that's also why they typically don't bed right next to it, is they feel that they're a little bit vulnerable near that water, as predators might congregate there. They're using the same water source, so typically they're going to feed away from it before they bed. And even when the bucks are pretty much nocturnal, that we're seeing when the temperatures are really hot earlier on, when we start going down there, is typically the deer won't be right at daylight or right at dark on the camera. Normally they're 2-3 hours into the night, sometimes 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. Same way with 4 o'clock in the morning. And I think it's the same reason, is they're moving a ways away from the water before they start bedding and before they actually get up and feed. That's how long it takes to get there.
For sure. Phil, I want to take a quick break here and mention the sponsors of this podcast. Go Hunt Insider has just released their Arizona draw odds, and with the new non-resident change, with the max bonus points, and now for non-residents being able to draw on the random pool, they've just released the Go Hunt Insider draw odds for Arizona, and I want to tell people that this resource, Go Hunt Insider, is incredible. And if they use the J Scott promo code when signing up for an insider membership, they get a $50 Coues gift certificate automatically emailed to them, and it also puts them in a drawing for a lot of great hunts and gear that Go Hunt gives away. Also, the Outdoorsman's here in Phoenix, the Optics Authority is where I get all of my binoculars and spotting scopes, and they've got a lot of great hunting gear. If the listeners use the J Scott promo code when they call or online at outdoorsmans.com, they're going to get a 10% discount. They can also call at 1-800-291-8065. The other sponsor is phonescope.com, and Phonescope does the best digiscoping adapters for your phones that I've seen out there, and they basically can adapt any phone to any spotting scope or binocular. And if you use the JScott16 promo code, you get a 10% discount when ordering online at phonescope.com. And then Real Game Calls makes the elk reel, and Drew Rouse there and his crew in Gypsum have just recently released the buck reel, and they are just releasing the turkey. I believe they're calling it the turkey reel for the upcoming spring season. And I've had a bunch of feedback from guys using the elk reel, which is a little wood call that makes some real nasally, authentic sounds. And you get 20% off if you use the J Scott promo code. And I want to thank all these sponsors for their support. Phil, back to what you were saying. It reminds me, the first time I ever went to Mexico was close to 20 years ago, and I actually hunted a ranch way south of Hermosillo, and I distinctly remember it being hot and dry, and there being basically 2 water holes on this whole property. And all the cattle, all the deer, all the coyotes, all the bobcats, basically that's where they got their water. And I was up on one of the cone knobs on this ranch and literally witnessing cattle walking 3 to 4 miles just to go down and get a drink of water. And I kept thinking in the back of my mind, well, surely the deer aren't going to travel that far to go get water. Well, absolutely they are. They have no other choice. And it made me realize that it's just everyday life for them. If they have to walk 2 or 3 miles or a mile or 5 miles to get a drink, that's what they're going to do. And I think they just get used to it. When you're looking at desert ranches, how does the amount of water holes on the property play into whether that's a ranch that you want to lease or not, from an availability standpoint of, it's got too much water, we don't have enough guys to man all these different water holes? What's your thoughts on that?
That's a really good question, and it's one we've had, my hunting partners and I have had several discussions about, because there's a couple different trains of thought here, and one is you want as much water as possible so the deer don't have to work as hard, so there are potentially more deer in the area. But like you said, it could also lead to problems because it's not congregating the deer at one certain tank or one certain water source. It's giving them so many options that it's virtually impossible to hunt successfully. You have to just, like winning the lottery, pick the right tank at the right time. But on the other hand, what I've found seems to be more important to look for is water that's going to be sustainable to you, to the deer, when you're going to be in the area hunting. You don't want a ranch that is going to have a bunch of water, say in the monsoons, but by the time you get there in December, January, those water sources are going to be dry, and those deer are then traveling to a neighboring ranch that you don't have. That can be as much, if not more, detrimental than not having any water, because I've witnessed the same thing, that the deer will travel as far as they need to get water, as long as they have the feed and the cover and the areas they feel comfortable in somewhere else. And it's a hard thing to look at. You want water You don't want too much water, but you want water that's sustainable. And by that I mean water that's going to be there when you plan to be there hunting. I've seen a number of times where I go down and scout a ranch early, could be in the summer, even the spring, and it's got pretty good water sources and a lot of deer. And then you go back when it's time to hunt, and those water sources are dried up, and those deer might still be there certain times, but they're traveling to the neighboring ranch to get water, so it drastically limits your ability to harvest that deer. And what we try and look for is not only sustainable water, but good cover and feed where those deer are going to try and more than likely live on that ranch year round, and where they won't be migrant moving as the season changes for water or feed. And it's very important, especially in the desert ranches, not only for your hunting ability, but also for your scouting ability. We use trail cameras almost exclusively in our scouting to get not only the quality of bucks, but the amount of bucks as well as the amount of does, so we have an idea on what the deer activity will be when that rut happens. And that's what we really try and look for, are water sources that are going to be there year-round, but also water sources just enough to sustain the deer that you want to hunt, but not too many where it's virtually impossible. Now, that also brings up another point that we've found is you can have a lot of water in the forms of, say, the cement drinkers or the windmills that the deer might not necessarily be using unless they have to. That's great water to sustain them during the dry times, but typically what we found is the deer prefer to use a dirt tank over a drinker if possible and available. So that's another thing we look at, is to make sure that there's enough dirt tanks that the deer feel comfortable that we have a chance of harvesting them at.
One of the things why I think the deer like those dirt tanks better is, I think, like you hit the nail on the head with the water this year's low, and a lot of these dirt tanks are big tanks, and so they actually have open areas. They come out of the brush, they get into the open area, and they're walking in the open down to the water, and they have the ability to hear, to use all of their senses of sight, smell out where they're, when you have a real tight spot of water, I think sometimes they're a little leery that, is a lion up in a tree, is a coyote waiting behind the bush to grab them. And so I think one of the challenges for you guys that you've seen is, certainly not as much with a rifle, but with your bow, your placement of your blinds is a challenge, because a lot of times they want to come out into the open, and a lot of times in those tanks they may walk for 40 or 50 yards in the open, which when the water's really filled up in the monsoon season, it may be all the way full, but as it gets to where it is now, which is some of the drier times, it may recede 40 or 50 yards, and they've got a nice open lane to go down and get a drink. I think the other thing that you've seen, and maybe you can answer on your trail cams, is it creates like a little rutting pocket. And I've seen deer glassing up on knobs and looking down at tanks and find those, those sand traps and stuff where the on the bottom side of the tank where the spillways and stuff, where it creates a nice open spot actually for those does to chase those bucks to chase those does around.
For sure, and we have seen it on our trail cameras, as well as seen it sit in the blinds, sit in the tanks during the rut. Is, like you said, it makes a nice, smooth, typically an open area where I think they feel comfortable, but also where the bucks have an opportunity to interact and check more than one doe at one time. And once they find that right one, it's a great spot for them to basically chouse them and move them around without putting themselves in danger, typically, because, as you said, it gives them that 40, 50 yard opening, sometimes more. Some of these tanks are huge, and they have 100 yard basically flat where they can mess around, and they don't have that fear of anything sneaking up on them or waiting behind the tree for them. And I think it puts the does more at ease than the bucks, because the bucks have one thing on their mind, but the does feel comfortable, and I think it allows them to spend more time there, which then is going to draw the bucks. And we've definitely seen that on the trail cameras. We've actually seen it starting already this year, where we've got a number of tanks and pictures where the bucks are in there checking the does, and the does are actually staying there for longer periods of time than normal.
Yeah, for sure. And I think sometimes in those tanks where the water recedes, sometimes you can get some of that. If you get any kind of little light shower, sometimes you get, little fresh green grass popping up and such, that we may look at and not see much, but they may look at it as a great meal there, and so they spend a little bit longer there, and they're kind of as the rut progresses. I think it becomes more of a social place and a social gathering. But I think, as Phil, and for the listeners out there that maybe are newer, Coues deer are keen, and their senses are always on alert, because they're 24/7, they're 365. They are being chased, and everything is after them. From coyotes to bobcats to lions to humans. There's nothing out there that's really their friend. Everything out there is trying to kill them.
It's interesting that you bring some of that up, and especially the new green growth. What we found is we'll go to these tanks, year after year, and especially when we're hunting new ranches, and check them. And some of the tanks might be dry, but what we found is that even the tanks that are dry, as long as there's another water source fairly close, those deer continue to come to those tanks. And it's especially for the green grass, the new growth, because the tank's fertile. It's had a lot of sediments in it and different soils that have washed down, through the washes, and you get a little shower and that green grass pops up instantly. And we have found a lot of deer and some really good bucks that are feeding at those dry tanks. And it's almost like a buffet, that you and I would think of it as, because the deer are coming in there, they're interacting, they're getting the nutrients they need, and it's in a spot that they feel comfortable at already. So it's been really interesting to see that. And just because you roll up and the tank's dry, if it's got that feed there and there's a water source fairly close, don't forget about it, because we've seen that a lot lately, that the deer still are using it, and they're using it more for groceries than they are for water. So it's an interesting thing you said that.
For sure. Let's hit on the quality of bucks that you're looking at. And the first question I would ask you, in your opinion, do trail cameras make the deer look bigger or smaller? Talking about their antlers, in your opinion.
That's tough, because you can look at a trail camera picture and add, I think, easily 5 to 10 inches on a normal average 100-inch deer just by the angle. And we've learned, and because the worst thing you can have happen is ground shrinkage, and that's something no one wants. So what we've learned is you can't just take one picture and make a solid judgment on the quality of deer. You have to have multiple angles, back, side. And another thing we found is night. Sometimes the flash of the trail camera can wash actually the tine length out or wash the mass out, but at other angles, due to the way that the shadows fall, it makes the deer look larger. So you can't go, and you have to be very hesitant off of judging a deer that you might only have 1 or 2 pictures of. What we've been fortunate enough to do with my hunting partners and I have gathered enough trail cameras that we can basically cover a tank up. So usually, if we're targeting a specific buck or a buck that piques our interest comes in, we'll have multiple angles at him so that we can really pick that deer apart and decide, hey, that's one we want to put on the hit list this year. Hey, that's a younger deer that we think has potential to grow in for next year. And that's part of the reason why we put so many trail cameras out, is that you don't have to just use 1 or 2 angles to judge the deer, because it can be very deceiving. And typically, if it's something that you think's right on the verge and you think it might not be there yet, it's not going to be. And you have to be, I wouldn't say you'd want to underjudge them, but you have to make your lengths and your mass measurements on the lower end, just so it's not a surprise when you first lay eyes on that deer. Typically, we'll go through all the cameras, and we'll know what deer we want to harvest going into the hunt, and it makes it good for guys that might not have as much experience in their Coues deer hunting, so that way they can have a good idea that as soon as that buck steps out, oh, that's the buck I've been looking at, that's the one I'm waiting for, I'm going to go ahead and take him. And that way there's no surprises. There are, typically, they're on the good end.
Yeah. I'm one that, darn, I think that, elk, deer, sheep, it seems like the cameras, in my mind, shrink them up. It seems like when you actually get the antlers in your hand, I think that rule of thumb, you're saying 5, maybe even 10 inches on some deer. To me, I see trail camera pictures of Coues deer, and over and over and over, in most circumstances, they look smaller. Like photos of sheep, they look smaller. Like photos of elk, it seems like they look smaller, and then you actually get the antlers in your hand, and they're bigger. And I've seen Coues deer photos on trail cameras before where I thought, that's not a very good deer, and then you see him in person, you're like, oh my goodness, that's a really nice deer. He's 8 or 10 inches bigger than I even thought he was. So it's interesting to hear your thoughts on that. Quality of bucks. If you have, like, what kind of buck, if first day comes in, would you shoot this year? I mean, are you at 110? Are you at 115? Are you at 120? Like, what would do it for you first day, first morning?
Going into the hunt, early on when we were getting our tags squared away and our deposits and everything, I had the bar set at 110, and I always leave a loophole, because that one buck might come in that has a crazy drop tine, and he might be 99 inches, but he's got a 5-inch dropper. So I always leave that loophole that if he has the look, that's going to be the one. But yeah. I went into the hunt saying 110. But after we spent some time down there and really started looking at the deer we have this year, my goal is right around the 115 mark. There's a couple bucks that just exploded this year that have shown up that are just giants in my mind, and what I consider a giant, that are pushing that 120, 125 range. And so that ups the bar for my standards. So there's a couple specific bucks that I'm targeting that if they come in first minute, first day, I'm dropping the hammer on, and that's the 112, 115 buck. I'm not going to say I'm going to pass him up for the 125 buck, but that's the quality of deer that we're looking at this year. And I'd be very surprised that unless someone just gets impatient, out of 6 tags, 7 tags, that someone's going to bring home anything under 105, 110.
That's awesome. That's fantastic. Well, it's going to be great to follow on Instagram. I encourage the listeners to find Phil on Instagram. Phil, what is your handle? It's Cramer Hunts, right?
That is correct, yes.
Yeah, Cramer with a C Hunts on Instagram, and follow Phil's success. And, we could probably do 10 other podcasts on this exact subject, but I know you're busy, and we covered quite a bit of ground today. So I want to thank you for coming on and spending time with us as our guest here, and giving us some of your knowledge, and just wish you the best of success and safe travels down there. And interesting, I heard the government, when we were down there on our last trip, doubled the price of gas. As you know, they own the Pemex. They own, all of the gas in Mexico. So your fuel cost just went up a little bit, but that's all part of the game, right?
That it is. I've been following that fairly closely. You can't really control what you're going to have to pay for it. You just have to be prepared for it. But more importantly, I didn't want to get down there and run out. So I've been trying to keep an eye on it.
For sure. Well, wish you the best of success down there. And I've had one of your hunting partners on, Tim Maddock, on this podcast before, and got real good feedback. And it's great talking to a fellow Coues nut, and so we'll probably have to check in with you after the season do a recap and see how things went. And I know it's tough hunting on those desert ranches, but the reward is big, and hope you and your buddies do really well down there.
Well, I appreciate it, Jay. It's been a pleasure and an honor to be on your podcast. I've listened to a ton of them, and it's always great feedback, and I enjoy everybody's different views on different opinions and subjects, and it's always things that are typically near and dear to my heart. That's hunting, and I look forward to the future, and good luck to you and Dar and your clients down there. It should be a great year.
Yeah, and before we go, I remember, didn't you take your daughter Osceola turkey hunting last year or the year before, and she got an Osceola?
I did. Actually, she's one away from her Royal Slam in turkey hunting at the age of 15. I took her to
What does she need?
She needs an Eastern,
what is she?
Ironically.
She needs
the most populated turkey there is. But yeah, I drew a Gould's tag a few years ago, and I signed it over to her. And she took her Gould's here in Arizona, and she was fortunate enough to take a Merriam's as well the same year up on the Wallapai Reservation, and that started her turkey hunting bug. So she came up to me all on her own. She said, "Dad, I'd like to try for the Royal Slam before I'm 18." So I knew a couple people over in Florida and called them up, and we booked a hunt, and we flew down there, and she took her first Osceola, and then I know a few people in Texas and got them involved, and we went over there, and she took a Rio. So with a little luck, she'll complete her Royal Slam of turkey hunting in Missouri this spring.
That's awesome. I can't wait to see her successes on that, and kudos for you for making those opportunities available for her, and it's just awesome that she loves turkey hunting and wants to achieve those high goals of getting the Royal Slam before she's 18. So that's really, really cool. And I just remember following that story, and you made a video, and it was just real enjoyable. So hats off to you for that, and getting the youngsters out there involved. And so yeah, buddy, take care. God bless, and thanks for spending time with us here.
Thank you, Jay. It's much appreciated. I enjoyed it.